Okay, so let's get going. The topic of this webinar is what is different at Toyota, specifically when we're talking about how they handle their materials, right, material flow. Now, there are a lot of things that are different in terms of other things they do there, but I want to focus on this one because they do an exceptionally good job at this factory that I'm familiar with, and also, we have a lot of things we can talk about, and I want to keep this to an hour or so. So we don't want to go over. Respect your time from that point of view. So my name is Richard Ron. I'm a principal with Leonardo Group, and let me share with you why or how I have some authority or experience in terms of talking about this subject, because I'm not a Toyota employee. And in fact, I've never worked for Toyota directly. But since 2010, we've been doing some workshops at Toyota, our public workshops, not to Toyota folks directly, although we've had participation from Toyota people, but primarily to outside folks to come to the Toyota Material Handling Factory in Columbus, Indiana, and hear about mixed model line design and mixed model material flow. And we've been doing that about 4 times a year, and I've been the principal instructor at those events for many years. And so naturally, when we're there, we're partnering with the Toyota ambassadors and the Toyota experts, and they're conducting plant tours, and there are a lot of discussions. And so I picked up a few things along the way in terms of how they do things. So I'm not going to share with you any secret information. This is something you could have seen yourself with your own eyes. But I just want to identify for you some of the top points that make Toyota essentially different from just about everyone else. So this is a picture of myself. We're in what's called the Rotunda, where we do some of our workshop activities. And behind me is a fork truck. So that's what they build at this plant. And they've grown since 2010. They've grown pretty substantially. They're the number one producer of fork trucks in North America, I think in maybe the world. But certainly they're number one in the North American market, and have been since around the year 2000 or so. And they continue to grow their market share. So anyone who talks about fork trucks, any other fork truck manufacturers, will generally concede that Toyota is the leader, right, in that particular market. Here's an example, again, from that same workshop. So we don't always use this room, but this is like their theater with super good audiovisual equipment and very comfortable seats, almost too comfortable sometimes. And this is an example from one of our previous classes. So we typically have about 25 people or so, 25 students from various companies that will come for a 3-day experience there. So before I get too far, let me share with you the next one just very quickly. It's coming up real soon. I think I saw this morning it was only 12 days away. So time is running out, but we do have a few seats remaining on this one. This is the line design class. It's going to be taught by my co-principal, Gerard Leone, co-author too of the Complete Guide to Mixed Model Line Design. So that's the subject here. So you can find out a lot more about what happens here, but I know it's short notice, but if you can make it, that's great. Mixed Model Line Design, the URL is shown down below on this slide. And we'll be putting it in the chat as well, the link to the information page on this one. All right, so let's get going. Here are the topics, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 key differences between how Toyota Material Handling, at least, does things versus how most everyone else does things when it comes to material handling. Now, Toyota has a lot of different factories. I've been to some of the other ones. But this particular factory in Columbus is a very good example for us because it's more human scale than some of the other factories. For example, the Georgetown factory in Georgetown, Kentucky, has a 1-minute tack time building cars, which is hard to get your head around, right? Every 60 seconds, there's a complete car coming off the end of the line. So you can imagine in that environment, things are moving pretty fast and there's a lot more automation. Now, the tack time at this factory in Toyota Material Handling is not slow. it's reasonably fast paced. It's around 3 to 4 minutes roughly on their main line. But that's a pace that is more human scale. You can actually see things a little bit more easily. And there's probably more labor, less automation in this factory. So it's a better example for many of us, both to learn about mixed model manufacturing, see it in action. It's easier to grasp, how things are moving and flowing in that kind of factory. So before I jump into each of these topics, so we're going to talk about one-by-one production, what we mean by true mixed modeling. There are various ways of mixing, and we'll talk about those. Very short delivery cycles on the factory floor for material delivery to the workstations. Talk about that. We'll talk about how they do things manually, not only in terms of building the fork trucks, but in terms of the material delivery system. There's some manual aspects which they could easily automate, but they have not. They've made a conscious decision not to automate and keep people involved. And then we have how they're handling their external supply chain. They have a domestic supply chain and they have an international supply chain, overseas supply chain. And then their attitude or respect for people, how material handlers are treated and classified in that environment. And before I jump into the details of these, I just want to share a story with you. It's actually a video. It's pretty good. It's by a couple guys called Key and Peele. Some of you may be familiar with them, Key and Peele. And they did one on a prayer group. So this prayer group is meeting in a house, and God appears to them sort of unexpectedly. And so they're all amazed, right, in the prayer group, and they say, God, well, what do you want of us? What do you want us to do? And God says, well, I documented it for you very clearly in my book, but let's go over it. I want you to sell all your possessions and dedicate your life to helping others, because as I've told you, I told you in the book, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. I told you that. So that's what I want you to go do. And all the people in the prayer group are dumbfounded and quiet, and they're all looking at each other. And then one of the prayer member groups jumps up and says, this house is haunted. It's haunted. And they all start screaming and they all run out. So they weren't ready for that. They weren't ready for that message. So from a lean point of view, we have a similar situation. We have some messages from the Toyota or lean world about what you need to do, but most companies don't follow that. So let's go over them quickly. We have one-by-one production, so we'll talk about that, or single-piece flow, right? Pursuing single-piece flow. We have zero defects. These are the principles of the Toyota production system. So we have zero defects, we have total elimination of waste, and we have respect for people. And we're going to be touching on all of those basically, but the difference between what this factory is doing, and there may be lots of others, right? I'm not accusing you of anything, but the point is, in my experience, what these guys are doing, they take seriously. They're taking seriously those 4 points, and they're pursuing them, whereas other companies are trying to bend the rules a little bit, or not taking them seriously, or applying them in a partial kind of way. All right, so with that said, let's get into it. I have actually some polls on some of these issues that I can pop up on your screen, and these polls are anonymous, so we won't be picking on you. When you're trying to think of how to answer it, you don't have to make a good impression. You can just be honest, because we don't know who you are, but we can look at the group watching this webinar and get some feedback in terms of you all. So here's the first one: focus on one-by-one production. So we may be familiar with this single piece flow, but when we normally conventionally think of it, we think of it as in the production line. So instead of batching, moving orders or products in batches through the line, we are trying to move our work one piece at a time, one unit at a time. Now, there's some environments where that happens naturally, logically, like automotive. Cars are big. It doesn't make sense to move them in batches of cars down the line. So they typically, even from the days of Henry Ford, we're going one car at a time. But a lot of smaller products, that's not done. They're moved in quantities, in batch sizes, for various reasons. So one of the goals of the Toyota production system, one of the North Star goals, as we said, is to try to strive to move products in the production one at a time. Now, we usually don't think of that. We don't apply that, again, conventionally, we don't apply that to our material delivery. We kind of assume, hey, that's not possible. It doesn't apply to material delivery. It only applies to the assembly line. But that is not quite true. In fact, what Toyota Material Handling strives to do, and I'm not saying they accomplish this, but they strive to apply the one-by-one production to everything, the entire value stream, including materials, including outside supplier deliveries. In fact, Henry Ford actually said this a long time ago, 100 years ago. He said, if I could do it, I'd have my suppliers deliver parts to the assembly line one at a time. I'd just hand off the part one at a time to the assembly line. But at least right now, he didn't say at least right now, but he said, but that's not possible. But that's what I would like to do. And so that's the approach we're taking. So definitely on the main line, one-by-one production is common, and probably many of you are doing that. Some of you are having problem connecting. I think if you reconnect, probably you can get back in. I'm not sure what the issue is with that. Now, what about other parts of the flow, parts of the value stream? So subassembly flow, definitely, that's common as well, where you're not building subassemblies in large quantities. You're building them. You're connecting the subassembly to the main flow one at a time. So same thing applies when we're talking about the products. Now, when we start talking about parts, however, material delivery, even in many factories, there are some parts that you basically have to deliver one at a time, or in very small quantities, because they're big and they're heavy, like engines. It doesn't make sense to try to move a whole bunch of engines in a big batch to the assembly line. You're typically moving them one at a time. Or large heavy items, like in a fork truck factory, you have the masts. So you're moving, the mast is a subassembly, and you're moving it to where it's installed on the fork truck, typically one at a time, and not allowing a big accumulation of those. So again, that all makes sense. But now we switch our thinking to outside suppliers and internal delivery of materials. The goal at Toyota Material Handling is to strive to deliver parts one by one to the assembly line for everything, if they can. But here are the challenges. If it's a very small part, then, and they're consumed in some quantity, then there would be a lot of material handling required, a lot of back and forth. So even today, they're not delivering one bolt at a time to the station. They're delivering them in containers, right? Typically with a Kanban system. But those containers contain a very small quantity of material, not a day's worth, not a week's worth, even though they could. They're small enough where you could do that. They're trying to reduce their inventory on the line for everything down to a few hours of usage. So even if it's in a container, it probably does not contain more than a few hours worth of actual usage for everything, right, across the board. So that does require, replenishing more often than if you just had a week's worth of a washer in a container. But that's part of the philosophy of striving to achieve one-by-one production. Now, when we go outside the factory, and by the way, at Toyota Material Handling, I'm just giving you ballpark numbers, probably 50 to 60% of their parts that are consumed on the assembly line are delivered in that way, in small containers, because the parts are small enough to be able to be used with that methodology. Now, about 40% are delivered in larger containers or larger racks, or they're larger parts. And again, the effort there is to deliver them in very small quantities. But again, it may not be one at a time. Engines may be one at a time. Transmissions may be one at a time. Other things may be in small groups of, say, 8 at a time or something like that. But again, the vision and the striving, the effort is to constantly try to reduce the quantities and move towards one-by-one production. And that's actually what's meant by North Star, right? It's your guiding principle. So that's happening. Now, what about remote or overseas suppliers? Let me back up. Local suppliers. So by local, we mean within the range of their milk runs, which is actually quite a large area. They strive to 1 day's worth of usage. So those milk runs are running daily, and they're bringing back to the plant a 1-day supply. So again, that's very just in time. And we could have that discussion, especially after COVID, about the wisdom of that. But that's part of the principle of one-by-one production. So within 1 day. And then remote overseas suppliers. So they have their mothership, the main fork truck factory in Japan, sends them quite a lot of stuff. But again, they're trying to reduce the quantities to a few days from Japan. Now that may sound crazy, but they can accomplish that by having a pipeline, essentially, of parts flowing daily from Japan to Columbus, Indiana, in large shipping containers, mixed parts in those shipping containers. So I'll spend a little bit more time on that in just a minute, but it's quite remarkable, what's being done. So overall, the amount of inventory that they have is very low compared to basically anyone I've seen, and not just for material on the factory floor, but material coming in from suppliers and even from overseas. It's quite amazing. And that's the adherence to this one-by-one production philosophy. So here are some images supporting these statements. For example, counterweights. On a fork truck, you've got this big casting, but it needs to get, kind of finished a little bit, and then painted, and then dried, and then delivered to the place where it's installed on the fork truck. And those flow basically synchronized one by one to the assembly line. So they're going through, prep, paint, dry, move, transport to the assembly line with only a few minutes between deliveries. So in other words, it's basically one by one or single piece for those kind of items. And that's similar again for how they manage engines, masts, and other big parts. Now, as I mentioned, on some items where they're big, they don't fit in the Kanban bin, but you want to restrict the quantities, they'll be using custom racks, something like this. So in this case, you might have some kind of welded piece, and they're delivering them in sets of 8, or maybe it's 4 sets. Maybe there's a left and right. I can't really tell. But those racks are the Kanban container, basically. So when the rack is empty, that's a signal to refill it. So you're limited to the amount of material that can fit in however many racks you have. But it's a very small quantity of those. And that's how they're managing these. All right. Now, in terms of their domestic supply route, this is kind of what they manage on a daily basis. So they send trucks out from Columbus, Indiana. They manage their own delivery system. They own their own trucks, in other words. And it goes to southern Minnesota and down to northern Georgia, if you can believe that. It's quite extensive. They have something like 12 different routes that fan out and come back. And that is the way they manage it is that pickup, that freight cost is paid for by Toyota. So if you're a supplier, you don't pay for the freight or have to manage the freight. They come and get it. However, the exception is if you miss a delivery for whatever reason, now you're on the hook to pay for the freight or the expedited delivery back to Columbus. If you happen to miss the milk run pickup, then it's on you. Otherwise, Toyota manages that whole system. So it's quite remarkable, to keep that running. So very much a just-in-time philosophy for domestic suppliers. And again, that's another reason why part of the material philosophy for their supply chain is to build long-term relationships with suppliers and not just find the cheapest price. I know in the aerospace industry, it was kind of like a rule, a law almost, that you had to have backup suppliers and multiple sources of the same item Toyota doesn't really do that, but they do invest in a long-term partnership to make sure that they're getting the quality they need. They don't inspect it when it comes back to Columbus. After the first few shipments of a part, they don't inspect it. So there's no receiving inspection. And then the delivery clearly, the reliability of delivery is clearly incredibly important. And so this is not something, developing this kind of supply chain is not something that happens overnight. And it's something that never ends, really, because you're always, having to certify new parts, and it's a constant relationship. But that's really one of their keys to success. I'll show you some examples of the overseas stuff in another example here. Okay, so before we move on, let's take a poll. I'm going to launch one of these polls. Oh, one by one. Here we go. The poll's already launched. Thank you, Michael. So is one-by-one processing a North Star goal at your organization? So 8% of you said yes as a published vision statement. Yes. So I guess that means lip service. I think that's what it means. Or yes, but it's not really a corporate goal. It's maybe the lean department or something like that understands that. And then 40% of you says, no, not really at all, right? It's not on your radar screen. That kind of goal is not on your radar screen. And let me digress for a minute when we talk about this issue, because it's so important and it's so kind of, as we can see here, it's kind of unique. So only 8% of you said, yeah, this is a goal. I don't know how seriously it's taken as a goal, but only 8% of you here in this, at least in this audience, said it's actually recognized or acknowledged as a goal. Now, when Taiichi Ohno, the father of the Toyota production system, retired from Toyota after many decades, he said that he was free to speak more freely about what they'd been doing in developing the Toyota production system. Not so much because he was retired, but because he said at this point, Toyota is pretty strong, and I'm not concerned about sharing some of these so-called secrets. But what he said was, back in the early days, his goal, Taiichi Ohno's goal, which was not accepted by too many people at the time, was to build what he called a river system. So he said, what I wanted to do was connect everything together, from outside suppliers to internal work, to think of it as a river, where the water in the river is like the materials that are required, and they come in from tributaries in different places, and to have that river not stopping. It's flowing continually from beginning to end. And so things like Kanban were a way of building that flow, and pull systems, right? And in-process Kanbans. And, he said it wasn't easy. People didn't get it. And he said the people that didn't get it the most were the finance people and the accounting people who he was battling with. He would get very emotionally upset even after he retired from Toyota when he started talking about those discussions. But that was his vision. That was his primary vision. So guess what? It wasn't eliminating waste. Eliminating waste was important in terms of building the river system. But what he said was, back in those days, we started seeing the success. And he said, even now, I'm not even sure why exactly. I can't explain to you exactly why, but we were getting tremendous benefits from focusing on this river system. But I didn't want to share that with everyone else. I didn't want to tell the world what we were doing exactly, because I was patriotic and I wanted to support other Japanese companies, but I didn't want to share with the Americans and the Europeans the secret for how we were making this happen. But I realized I just couldn't say nothing, right? I had to share something. And so I kind of made up this story like a red herring, right, to send people off track. And that red herring was, Lean, the Toyota production system, is all about eliminating waste. And that's the message. That's a story I told, because I knew that people would hear that and they'd think, yeah, that makes sense. That's Toyota's secret, eliminating waste. And then they were going to go off and they were going to eliminate waste everywhere, try to. And sure, they would get some benefits, so they wouldn't get suspicious, right? They get some benefits by doing that. But what they wouldn't realize is, if you eliminate waste in a value stream that's not on the critical path, then that time is not going to get shorter, right? You're not going to reduce that time from launch to finishing the product, or you're not going to make your value stream shorter. You're going to be doing a lot of stuff. So that was his strategy, to send people off the track. Now, that doesn't mean that eliminating waste is not important, because that's a way, again, to shorten the value stream. But that was his secret. And he said, I can tell you the truth now, many years later, because Toyota is now like the #1 car maker in the world. I'm not worried about Toyota. But at the time, I was very concerned that Americans were just going to hear the river secret and then just apply it and really be much stronger competitors by sharing that secret. So I thought I'd tell you that story because that's really critically important with this whole thing. All right, so let's keep going here. True mixed model production. So what is mixed modeling? Well, it's basically the idea, and it's not a secret, and it's not a rare. It's common for most of us, where you're having to build a lot of different models on the same production line, and the models are similar, within the same product family, basically, but different sizes, different options, etc. Like air conditioners, you might have 10 different models, different capacities, but I can't have different assembly lines, or don't want to have different assembly lines for every different individual model. So we're going to mix them. And the issue is this: if I'm mixing products on the line, they don't have the same work content. Some are harder, right? Some are bigger, some are smaller, some have less work content. And so if I don't mix them skillfully, and this is what we teach in the mixed model line design workshop, if I don't manage that line skillfully, I'm going to have a lot of times where the workers have no work, or they can't work because the line is blocked. You're going to have a lot of variation in the workflow, and that's not good from a productivity and a throughput point of view. So if you don't manage it well, your throughput's going to go down and your productivity is going to go down, guaranteed. So that's what we're discussing here with mixed model manufacturing primarily. But again, it's not a rare thing. A lot of us have those situations, those challenges. So how do we deal with mix? Well, some companies, they'll focus on one product at a time. So they'll build a weekly quantity or monthly quantity. The issue there is you're probably not building to order. You're building to forecast of some kind, and then you're taking those products and you're putting them on a shelf somewhere, right, and hope to sell them later. So that's really not what we want. Or you build the same product in smaller quantities. So you can't get to true one-by-one mixing, but you build in a small batch, and then you do a changeover, and then you build some other product in a small batch. So that's better, right? You're moving in the right direction, but that's not really the ultimate. Another strategy is you build customer order quantities only. So the batch quantity varies depending on what the customer ordered, but you just build those quantities as a quote unquote batch, but you're building to order. So you don't have to inventory it. You're not building finished goods. So again, that's a step in the right direction, but really not what we want. And then what Toyota Material Handling does with their fork trucks is they mix models one after another, different models one after another. So the end result is they could have a customer order, and they could spread that order, the build for that order, over a whole week. So what you're going to see at the end of the line at Toyota Material Handling is a staging area with finished fork trucks that have a customer order, but they can't ship them yet because they need to ship complete, or ship the whole order complete. So when you first see it, you might think, oh my God, I thought this was the great Toyota, and look at all this inventory, finished goods inventory. But no, it's not finished goods inventory. It's simply staged parts, staged fork trucks that have been sold that are simply waiting to get loaded on a truck together in some order quantity. So that's different. We're not so concerned. That's not really what we'd call finished goods inventory, although it does take up some space, right, to do that. So that's what we want to do. Now, let's get back to materials, right? Materials is our topic. You've got to deliver materials for different products coming down the line. Potentially every one coming down the line is different, has different parts. So you can appreciate the challenge there of having to do that. So at Toyota Material Handling, the challenge is over 50 base models. They actually have 3 assembly lines. There are some units that are just too different, right, to mix. For example, they're the very large ones, extremely large ones, just are not a good fit on their main assembly line. And then they have a 3-wheeled vehicles that, again, for various reasons are not a good fit. Those are lower volume, but their main assembly line has over 50 base models. The number of options is far greater than in automotive, in the automotive industry. And then again, as I mentioned, 3 different assembly lines with lower volume. So that's the challenge. That's not a minor detail, as you can appreciate. So what they have to do is manage very short cycle times on material delivery. Again, I'll talk about that in a minute. And they have to be able to handle all these options and and differences between one unit and another coming down that line, which is quite a remarkable thing, right? So in order to accomplish that, I mean, the reason I'm sharing that with you is in order to accomplish that, one of the techniques is very short delivery cycles. What do I mean by that? Well, they have, most of the parts are delivered via a tugger system. There may be one or two like those counterweights that I shared, which are delivered with a fork truck. But basically, they have a policy of keeping fork trucks out of the production area completely. So they have tuggers that are delivering parts. But how often does a tugger come by to deliver to a workstation or work area? It's actually a very short amount of time. So the planned time between deliveries is what we mean by the delivery cycle. And the pros of the benefits of a short delivery cycle is they can manage this mix that they have more easily, because you're going to be replenishing the parts at a station more often than you otherwise might decide to. So the amount of material required at the workstations is reduced. The amount of inventory you have at the workstation is reduced. The amount of storage at the workstations is reduced by delivering more often, more frequently. The risk of part shortages or the ability to respond to changes is better, right? Because you're coming back to the stations more often, right? With material delivery. Again, space, I mentioned that before. The footprint of these workstations is reduced dramatically. So the negatives of a short delivery cycle, well, you've got to do more handling. And this was always a challenge back in my early days of doing lean consulting. In fact, we were teaching this kind of thinking that, hey, material handling is kind of a second-class work, and it's really not adding value, right? You're not changing the form, fit, or function of the product when you're just moving material around, and so therefore you should strive to reduce material handling, right? So you may have heard this: reduce the number of touches, right? Reduce the number of times that you have to handle parts, because it's non-value adding work, and let's try to not do so much of that, because it's, strictly speaking, it's muda, or waste. Right? That was our thinking. That's not the thinking at Toyota Material Handling, however. I'll get to that in a minute. So you will require more material handling, unavoidably, right? If you're delivering more often, and you may have more need for material delivery equipment. So if you're running delivery routes more often, then you may need more tuggers, more carts, more of that kind of stuff to do it. So that's the con you might see. So here's how they run it at Toyota. This is the real deal, folks. I mean, this is how they actually do it. So they have what we call supermarkets or markets set up. In fact, most of the material they have on the factory floor goes from supplier to the market. It doesn't need to go to a warehouse, because they're only managing about a day's worth of domestic parts. In inventory, they're getting daily shipments. So those parts don't need to go anywhere else. They can go directly to the supermarkets, I should say, because they have 3 of them. So they have small portions delivery. So, hardware type items, or container-based Kanban type items. That's one area. And then they have another area they call parts control center. So this is an internal supermarket for larger type items. And then they have a separate one, the PDC, for imported parts from Japan, typically, those kind of items. Now, these are 3 different supermarkets, but it all needs to be loaded onto a cart. And so they have what's called a consolidation point. They call it the baton touch. The idea here is there's a handoff, right? There's a handoff from the supermarkets to a small group that's loading the carts onto a tugger, connected to a tugger. And those tuggers go out and this blew my mind when I first saw this, every 35 minutes. There's going to be a delivery cycle every 35 minutes or 12 times a day, 12 cycles a day. So for most companies, that's really often. Every 35 minutes, someone comes by with a tugger to pick up empty containers, pick up the Kanban cards, and deliver parts. But that's one way to manage this mix, this variability, very frequent deliveries. And clearly, of course, you're reducing the amount of inventory. So you're moving closer and closer by doing this to a single piece flow or one-by-one production philosophy as applied to parts. So that's a huge difference, I would say, for most places that we visit. And they run it like clockwork, by the way. Now, let's talk about manual processes. Another thing that Toyota does differently, at least at this factory, they've retained the manual aspect of certain parts of the process. They could afford to automate everything. They could. They have the money to do that, the capital they could invest. But they have made a conscious decision to retain some of this material delivery system as a manual process. Okay, we have a couple more polls. I'll get to it. There are a couple more polls, I think. I don't know if you're launching these, Michael. Yes. So here we go. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. So what are they doing manually? Well, primarily they've maintained the use of paper Kanban cards as opposed to electronic Kanban, sensors. You know, there are all kinds of other ways you could manage the signaling, you know, that I need material at a station, but they've maintained the use of paper Kanban cards. So what are the pros of that? Well, it's the most flexible choice. You can move work around. You know, the card is a physical object. So if I move material from one location to another, the card would go with it. It's easy to to manage that. Also, in terms of work, talking about work versus automation, people are more flexible clearly than machines. Right? People can work at different workstations. They can move. Harder to do if you're trying to automate that process. And then depending on the cost of automating something, it actually may be a lower cost option, maybe cheaper, right? Just to have people do it by hand. The concern or the cons of manual processes, one of the concerns is, does this require a lot of time? So labor is not cheap. So is this driving up my costs? Is this going to drive up more material handling costs, for example? Does this drive up the use of equipment, the need for equipment? So when we talk about manual process and Kanban system, here's basically how it works. And this is pretty cool. So here's a sample card. This is a card actually from Toyota. You can see I think it's a Japanese part because it says supplier name Takahama. That's the mothership, in Japan. So it's a part. Other than that, it's the traditional stuff. They have a barcode. They got a part number. They have a description, et cetera. They have locations where it goes. So pretty traditional kind of paper card. And here's how the system works. So follow me, walk through me, go with me on this description here, starting at the line at the bottom of this image. So I'm an operator working on the line, and I'm consuming parts out of a Kanban bin. Now, not everything comes in a Kanban bin. I may have parts delivered in a rack or just delivered to me one at a time. But assuming that we're focusing on the Kanban bins here, I use the last part in a bin. I pull forward a bin that's right behind it. So traditional kind of Kanban system. And there's a card sitting on top. And what I'm supposed to do is take that card and I'm going to put it in a collection box. Now, that collection box is somewhere nearby. It could be on my workbench. I don't have to walk over and put it in a Kanban collection box. It's right there, right? So the amount of time to do that is minimal. So pick up, put it in the box. So then what? Well, as a worker, nothing. I keep on working, keep on trucking. That's all I needed to do. But why did they have a person do that? Well, they didn't want to break the connection between a person saying, okay, my job is I'm using these parts and I have to signal that I'm going to need more in the future. And the way I do that is I take this paper card into my physical hand and I put it in a box. That's part of my job. What they didn't want to do was disconnect the operator so they don't have to even ever think about it, that they have parts in front of them and they're just somehow magically always going to appear through some completely automated system. They did not want to do that. They wanted to engage the people and engage them in their role of submitting that signal. Great. Next step in the signaling process. Remember, every 35 minutes, that tugger is going to come around and they're going to want to pick up those cards. But right now, at least, that card is at the workstation. So those cards need to get moved over into a central collection spot for the tugger driver, right, to be picking up those cards, those paper cards. And so that's the job of the team leader or the assistant team leader, to go around and collect those cards, just do a walkthrough. It takes a minute, it doesn't take long, but pick up those cards from the individual or child collection boxes and put them into a master or parent collection box on the line so the tugger driver can pick them up. That's what you see here in this image. We have two mailboxes there, so the second one would be the second collection box. So every 35 minutes, the cards get picked up. They get delivered to the scanning office. Now, scanning office, that's like a workstation where they have a piece of scanning equipment and it gets scanned electronically. And I had another webinar I did not too long ago talking about how they error-proof this entire process. No time to get into it now, but trust me, they have a ways of following up if the cards don't get submitted or if a card should get lost. But we'll cut to the chase here. They get scanned and then the orders get sent to the various areas, the various supermarkets, to be prepared for maybe not the next cycle, but maybe the one after that. Things are moving pretty fast every 35 minutes. There may not be enough time, once you submit the card and it gets picked up, to have that part come back to the station the very next cycle. That's probably not going to happen. It's going to be 1 or 2 cycles after that. Just the time to get them picked and get delivered and put in the card and get driven back to the station. That's fine. That's part of the plan. But the overall objective here is we're going to have only a few hours of Kanban parts at the stations, and we have a very robust process to get them back to that station. And it involves some automation, like the scanning office. They're not scanning them with a scan gun. They have like a machine that, like a cash counter, that scans them automatically. But they have a manual process of people taking those paper cards and submitting them, and they have not wanted to give up on that. Right? They want to engage the entire workforce, and part of your job is you got to pay attention to your parts, and you got to make sure you're signaling. All right, so let's see. Kanban system, let's see what the poll says. Can we refresh that? What do I have to do? I see the zeros. Let me try again. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so all of you have some kind of Kanban system, but not the way we described it, which is fine. What we used to teach was, hey, don't set your Kanban quantities so small because it requires a lot of work to deliver the bins. And so, put a day or a week or whatever, keep those Kanban quantities. Oh, great. Sorry, the results changed. Using paper Kanban cards. No, 60% are not using Kanban. Okay, well, that's an interesting thing. And only 40% of you are using Kanban, but not as we're describing it. So I don't know if this gives you any ideas, but we're guilty. I'm guilty as charged for years teaching people, hey, don't undersize your Kanban quantities because then you're going to be having to refill them too often. And surprise, surprise, when we showed up at Toyota, that's exactly what they want because they're trying to reduce material, at the stations by delivering more often. Okay, let me look at time. We've got about 15 minutes. I'm trying to keep it to an hour, so let's keep on going here. Oh, and 14% of you use electronic Kanban. Well, as I explained to you, that's an option. And probably part of the thinking is take people out of the loop, right? Intentionally take humans out of the decision-making and automate it to maybe reduce errors, right, in signaling. That would be the normal logic. But again, I'm sharing with you, Toyota had kind of like the opposite approach. No, We want people involved, engaged in moving those cards. All right, so let's talk about the external supply chain. So we talked about milk run. Delivery, definition of external supply chain is delivery of materials from outside the formal milk run distances. So we're not talking about their domestic milk runs. One day we're talking about overseas. My impression is that Toyota Material Handling has a little bit easier situation because I believe that their mothership acts as kind of a distribution center. They may be getting parts from different places, but they all kind of get consolidated in Japan and then they get shipped to Columbus. So it's a little bit easier for Toyota maybe than some of you that might have suppliers from all over the place, and there is no consolidation point really. Okay, so the concern here with pulling, from doing a just-in-time kind of strategy from far away is that if that gets disrupted, then you're kind of in trouble. And this was exacerbated or highlighted during the COVID period, where companies that had pretty good just-in-time situations coming from far away found that, whoops, we're stopped, right? We're not getting parts. And Toyota was not exempt from that situation. Some of the other concerns with just-in-time from remote suppliers are transportation costs. So a typical pushback in trying to go to more just-in-time from overseas is, no, we can't do that because we have to, we have to ship in larger quantities to minimize our freight costs or our transportation costs. We can't really do that. And then, of course, we have the issue of lead time coming from overseas, where you're not going to get it in one day. You're going to get it in X weeks or more. And then the question of flexibility. What happens when something changes? When you're coming from overseas, you don't have a lot of flexibility, at least not in the short term. Now, pursuing a just-in-time strategy from overseas has some clear benefits if you can be successful with it. That is a radical reduction in raw material inventory. If you're shipping in huge quantities from China, then you've got huge quantities in your warehouse, right, of those parts. If you can somehow reduce those through more frequent deliveries or other strategies I'll share with you, then you can reduce that inventory. And if you can be flowing parts from overseas in mixed quantities, then you can actually improve your flexibility. Not at the same level as if you had a domestic supplier close by, but still you can make improvements in your ability to respond to changes a little bit more easily. So here's how they do it. This is like how they do it from Japan, how Toyota does it. They have in the traditional thinking, I have some quantity to deliver from overseas, and I need to reduce my freight costs, so I have to deliver large quantities from overseas. And maybe even the outside supplier says, oh no, minimum quantity X, right? Some huge minimum quantity. So Monday, I've got a yellow part that's coming in some big quantity, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, etc. So these are big shipments. Now, what if you could take that same quantity and the same number of shipments? So I'm not increasing the number of shipments. I'm not increasing my freight costs. It's the same number of shipments. But what I'm doing is I'm mixing within each container all the different, in this case, 5 different parts. I'm mixing them all in the same container. And I'm shipping, instead of a weekly quantity, in this example, I'm shipping a daily quantity, right, of each of the parts. So same number of shipments, it's just that within each container, it's a mixed bag. So in point of fact, Toyota Material Handling is getting shipments from Japan daily, virtually daily, that go from Japan to Seattle or Los Angeles. No, I think it's Seattle. And then it goes on train to Chicago, and then it goes on a truck to Columbus. And those trucks are arriving with shipping containers from Japan every day, which is pretty amazing. Now, they have the job when they get to Toyota of opening up those containers, and what you see inside is a big mix of parts. So there is a task. It's not as easy as you just get a container and you put it away, because they have literally dozens or hundreds of different items in those containers. And so they have to be, sorted out and put away. That is additional effort, But the result then is that the amount of inventory that they have of parts from Japan is radically less than in basically any other place that we've seen. Now, what happens when you have a COVID situation? Well, no one's exempt from that. But the funny thing was, so they had to deal with it, and they had some disruptions. There's no doubt about it. But the funny thing was, this story was shared to me by a Toyota ambassador. They said that people inside Toyota, would come to him and they'd say, well, now that we see what COVID did to supply chains, then clearly we're giving up on this just-in-time strategy from Japan, right? That's not working for us. And he just laughed and he said, that would be like Christians giving up on this Jesus thing. This is part of our approach. We're not giving up on just-in-time or one-by-one production. Absolutely not. So again, they came up with workarounds, ways of dealing with these challenges, but these challenges were not permanent, right? They were an exception, and they weren't going to give up on their core values just because something happened, like COVID, right? Absolutely not. So that's basically how they're doing it, and that's quite different, again, from most other places. Last comment, we have a few minutes left here. Last comment is how Toyota handles their workforce, right? Their material handling workforce. Remember, one of those 4 principles was respect for people. So how are material handlers respected? Well, one way they're respected at Toyota anyway is they're not indirect. They're not classified as indirect people. So all the Toyota material handling organization is considered direct. They don't have an indirect. They're considered just as valuable and necessary as the people on the assembly line building the product. They're not treated in any different kind of way. I don't know how that affects their actual wages. It is a different job category, but it's, in terms of classification, this whole thing about indirect people are not adding value and they're not as valuable to us. That is not what you see at Toyota. Everyone's part of the same team, right? Everyone's part of the same team. So, and the importance with that is that most companies use product costing system that treats indirect costs as overhead, right? So you've got cost of material to try to estimate the cost of a product. You've got the material that went into the product, and then the direct cost, the direct labor that's attributed to building that product. And then you have this big pool of other costs, which are called overhead. And material handling is in that overhead pool. And so how much overhead should we apply to the product? Well, again, traditionally it's, well, how much direct labor went into that product? So then we'll take a percentage, or that fraction, we'll allocate overhead to the product based on how much direct labor went into it. The problem with that is that, number one, that gives you the idea that the way to reduce product cost is to reduce direct labor, right? Because that's how the formula works, right? So if I reduce the number of people on the assembly line, put in some robots or something, my product costs are going down. It seems, but they're not really, because in today's world, most of your cost is overhead, or maybe the highest percentage is material, and second most is overhead. It's not direct labor. And so there may be other ways to apply that overhead other than direct labor. You might use cycle time. That's one thing we recommended for many years, is what is the cycle time of these different products? How long, what's the manufacturing cycle time to get through the line, and use that as the basis for application of overhead. That's an idea. I haven't seen too many people actually do that, but that's an intriguing idea. But the point here is, basically, in terms of respect for people, the material handling group is not a second-class citizen group. It's part of the direct labor applied to the building of the product. And very much that's how people are treated and are viewed, right? We're all one big team. They're not the direct team and then these, Muda type work and people the material handlers, which I think is very, very refreshing. Okay, so I think that covers the main differences. So I hope you can appreciate that, the way they're doing things is, as we've seen from the polls here, pretty different from the way most companies are run. And you might say to yourself, yeah, but all that seems to be adding more cost. But if you look at the profitability of Toyota versus their competitors, Toyota material handling compared to, who are the competitors? Crown, Mitsubishi, Hyster, Yale. If you compare their corporate health, let's say, to any of those competitors, Toyota wins by a large margin. So not only do they seem to be doing things that are counterintuitive that we wouldn't do because we can't add more material handlers. Our rule of thumb is we only allow 2 material handlers for every 10 operators, some kind of formula. Yeah, and so Toyota seems to have more than that. I believe they do. But what's important at the end of the day is not how many people you have exactly. It's how much is left over. How much profitability is left over after doing all this work. And Toyota, for some reason, seems to be leading the pack in terms of not only building good products, right, and gaining market share because they're number one, but they're also profitable, which is quite amazing. It's again, admittedly, it's counterintuitive, but this is what they're doing. But I think that probably most companies have not been willing to take that leap and really embrace the 4 principles of the Toyota production system truly, right, and fully. They've been willing to adapt pieces of it. And therefore, they get pieces of the benefits. They don't get the entire benefit. But it does require someone, I think probably someone at the top of a company, like they had at Toyota and they have today, people who are not going to give up on those principles for short-term gain, right? People who are going to lead the company from the top with these principles. Here's what we're going to do, and not allow deviation, even in the face of a COVID pandemic or other challenges. No, we're not going to give up on those key principles. All right. So with that, I'm going to let you go. There's a mixed model material flow workshop. We have a few seats left for that. Again, it is filling up. So if this is something you're interested, if you want to see what I just talked about in action, and you should, I think you should, the best way is to go there, right? Go to the Toyota plant, same one I've been talking about. And it's a 3-day workshop on November 12th through the 14th. Spend 3 days, learn mixed model material flow methods, and then go out on the factory floor and see it all in action. Life-changing experience. If you're a material flow person or a lean specialist, life-changing experience. Once in a lifetime experience that you'll never forget. To see how this is actually working with your own eyes, and not just hear about it, but see it with your own eyes. So, but there are only a few seats left, so I wouldn't dilly-dally around if this is something you want to go to, because it's going to fill up. I would say within the next few weeks, it'll be, which is great because November's more than 3 months away, but it's going to happen. So you better take action. Not trying to scare you. The other thing is, if you want to learn about all this stuff but can't make it to Toyota, we have our Lean Design Studio. Recommend that you check that out. Just go to leandesignstudio.com. That'll take you to an information page, and you can see what we're offering there, including a full certificate class in mixed model material flow available there in terms of online courses, tools, all kinds of stuff. So with that, I will let you go.